Between 1095 and 1291, thousands of European Christians seized Jerusalem, establishing Crusader states in the Levant and ruling over Muslim subjects. But why did they do it, and how did their relationship with their Muslim subjects develop over the next centuries? This is my channel, and today we're going to find out what the Crusaders got up to. The First Crusade was launched after Pope Urban II called for holy war in 1095. He claimed that the road to the holy sites in Jerusalem was dangerous for European pilgrims, and he wanted this to change. Although the Pope hoped for peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims, his followers were more zealous. God had spoken to him, or so he believed, and ordered him to lead his followers to the Holy Land. It took 2 years for the Crusaders to get there. After long and hard marches, they arrived in Anatolia in 1097. They then proceeded to sack the city of Nicaea, the first important city on their way to Jerusalem. It was during the siege of Antioch in 1097, however, that the crusade almost fell apart. During the 21-day siege, the Crusaders suffered from starvation and disease. And when word spread that help was on the way, many of the Crusaders wanted to return home. Diaz had abandoned them, or so they thought, and only the arrival of reinforcements led by Bohemond of Taranto prevented the collapse of the expedition. From Antioch, the Crusaders marched south towards Damascus, where they fought against the armies of the Zengid dynasty, a powerful Turkish state that controlled much of Syria at the time. The Crusaders defeated the Muslim army and sacked the city, and after suffering further losses due to starvation and disease, they continued on to their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. After a siege of 6 weeks, the Crusaders captured the city. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred, and the survivors were given the choice of converting to Christianity or leaving the city. Those who stayed behind had to pay a heavy tax. Most of the women and children were exempt from paying this tax, unless they were Jewish. In fact, all Jews were forced to convert or leave the city. What followed was a period of pillage and looting, targeting both Muslims and Jews. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people are said to have been killed. Women and children were taken hostage and ransomed, and the Crusaders established a Latin patriarchate in Jerusalem. Though the city was captured in 1099, the conquest was not completed until 1102, when the last pockets of resistance were crushed. By 1100, the Crusaders had carved for states out of the Levant, each with its own ruler. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south, which included modern-day Israel and the Palestinian territories. The county of Edessa in the northeast near the city of Urfa, the Principality of Antioch in the north, and the county of Tripoli along the Mediterranean coast. Not everyone in these areas was happy about the arrival of the Crusaders. In fact, the local Christian population hated them. This may seem confusing, since the Crusaders were supposed to be liberating the Holy Land from Muslim rule, but their behavior made it impossible for the two groups to coexist peacefully. To solve this problem, the Crusaders tried to transplant European feudalism into the East. In theory, the King of Jerusalem would have supreme authority, but in practice, the regional princes enjoyed more or less independence. This caused a lot of tension and fighting, and it also discouraged potential allies from helping the Crusaders. After all, if you want to conquer a region, it helps to have the locals on your side. Unfortunately, this was not an option for the Crusaders. Relations with the local Christian population never improved. They preferred living under Muslim rule because the alternative meant paying heavy taxes, being forced to convert to Christianity, or being killed. The Crusaders didn't fare any better among their Muslim subjects either. As we saw, the early Crusades were motivated by religious zeal and conquest. The Crusaders murdered anyone who didn't submit to their rule, whether they were Muslim or Jew, but it wasn't only the fanaticism of the common foot soldiers that caused problems. Even the leadership was guilty of terrible abuses. For example, in 1148, the Crusaders besieged the city of Zara, a Christian city in modern-day Croatia. When the inhabitants refused to open the gates, the Crusaders drowned many of them, tortured prisoners, slaughtered civilians, and even killed some of their own men who tried to stop them. This brutality shocked contemporary chroniclers and ordinary people alike. Many called for the Pope to excommunicate the guilty parties, but he refused. As the Crusades dragged on, the Crusaders became more and more desperate for success. And in 1183, Pope Eugene III declared a new crusade. 5 years later, the first Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land. They expected to find a warm welcome, but instead they were attacked by Muslim forces. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, ending Crusader hopes of ever conquering the city again. Things got worse in 1192 when Richard the Lionheart led an army to regain Jerusalem. But after besieging the city for 8 months, he was forced to withdraw his troops. Richard wasn't exactly known for his diplomacy skills, so it's no surprise that he failed to capture Jerusalem. To give you an idea of his personality, here's how he responded to a request for surrender. "We will never accept truce nor quarter, nor will we believe anything that comes from your lips. We are come into the land to do battle with thee and to destroy thee." Although the Third Crusade failed to recapture Jerusalem, it did lay the foundations for a new era of Muslim-Christian relations in the Holy Land. Richard negotiated a treaty with Saladin that granted European Christians access to Jerusalem. So although they weren't allowed to stay in the city, they could visit for a limited time. The economic impact of the Crusades is a difficult subject to discuss because the effects varied so much from person to person. For some, the Crusades were devastating. Entire villages and cities were wiped off the map, not to mention the millions of people who died in battle. Others benefited greatly from the influx of wealth generated by the Crusades. Venetian merchants, for example, grew rich transporting Crusaders to the Holy Land. Even ordinary people benefited from the Crusades in some ways. New foods and products became available, and Crusaders brought back interesting ideas from the East, including scientific theories, mathematical concepts, and medical techniques. But what about the Muslim world? Did they benefit from the Crusades as well? There's evidence to suggest that the Crusades stimulated intellectual life in Muslim Spain, Syria, and Egypt. This happened because Muslim scholars wrote about the infidels they encountered during the Crusades. Because of the negative descriptions of European culture, Muslim scholars felt compelled to defend their own culture and religion. The result was a flourishing of science, philosophy, and art. The arrival of the Crusaders in the Holy Land gave rise to tensions and hostilities between the two religions. And unfortunately, this attitude soon found its way into everyday life. Common people were taught to view members of the other religion as inhuman, violent, and primitive. This had a huge impact on the development of the two religions because it created an image of the other that persists to this day. This stereotype eventually led to the idea that Muslims and Christians belong to completely different worlds and that they can never truly understand one another. In fact, it has been argued that the Crusades invented Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. There were undoubtedly moments of cultural exchange between the two groups, but these were few and far between. Many Crusaders adopted Eastern customs in food and clothing, and some Islamic elites were influenced by European military tactics. But these instances don't cancel out the violence and oppression committed by the Crusaders. Overall, the influence of the Crusades on daily life was negative. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold fell in Acre. Although the Crusades were over, their influence would continue for centuries. In Europe, the Crusades became a symbol of religious conflict and war against infidels. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, they became a symbol of colonialism and cultural exchange. What do you think? How would you describe the relationship between the Crusaders and their Muslim subjects? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe for more content. Hello and welcome to this channel. The Crusades were a series of religiously sanctioned military campaigns initiated, supported and sometimes merely tolerated by the Western European Church and its leaders primarily from 1095 to 1291. They are widely known for their initial objective to reclaim the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem. which had fallen under Muslim rule following the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. At the core of the story lies a clash of cultures and religions, the encounter between European Christians and the Muslims who had controlled Jerusalem for over 2 centuries. But beyond the battles and sieges, there is a less-known narrative of cultural exchange and adaptation. This period saw the fusion of artistic motifs, the transmission of scientific knowledge, and the evolution of local economies, all shaped by the encounters of 2 distinct civilizations. The First Crusade, spanning from 1095 to 1099, marked the beginning of this complex relationship. Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, where he urged European Christians to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims, was a pivotal moment. What followed was a mass migration of European warriors, many driven by religious zeal, but also motivated by the promise of land and riches. The journey to the Holy Land, however, was not just a religious pilgrimage. It became a crash course in cultural exchange. European travelers encountered not only fellow Christian communities in the East, such as the Kingdom of Armenia, but also Muslim rulers like Saladin. This clash of cultures during the Crusades was not always harmonious. There were instances of violence and intolerance. However, amidst the conflict, there were moments of understanding and even coexistence. Cities like Jerusalem became melting pots where different cultures intertwined. After the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, European leaders established Crusader states in the Levant, creating a complex administrative system that attempted to govern both Christian and Muslim subjects. This required not only military force, but also cultural diplomacy. The cultural impact of the Crusades went beyond the battlefield. For instance, the architectural influence of the East on the West was profound. European travelers were captivated by the grandeur of mosques like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, with its magnificent mosaics and stunning views. Elements of Islamic architecture can be seen in the later construction of European churches and castles. Similarly, the exquisite craftsmanship of Islamic art, including calligraphy and geometric patterns, may have inspired European artisans. The exchange of ideas didn't just flow in one direction. Europeans also brought with them their own cultural offerings, such as illuminated manuscripts and Gothic cathedrals. Perhaps one of the most significant legacies of this era is the preservation and transmission of ancient knowledge. During the Crusades, European scholars like Peter the Iberian and Gerard of Cremona became fascinated by Greek and Arabic texts that had been largely overlooked or forgotten in the West. This included scientific treatises on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. This rediscovery of classical learning, sparked in part by the Crusades, would later become a cornerstone of the Renaissance. The economic impact of the Crusades was equally profound. While the religious zeal of the early Crusaders may have been unwavering, later expeditions were often financially motivated. By the time of the Third Crusade in the 1180s, European rulers understood the economic potential of the East. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, with their extensive trade networks, financed many crusading armies, hoping for access to lucrative Eastern markets. This economic interest led to the establishment of commercial colonies like those in modern-day Lebanon. Moreover, the Crusades inadvertently helped to break down the self-sufficient manorial economy of feudalism. As trade increased, so did the need for sophisticated accounting and banking systems. Italian city-states became centers for international finance, laying the groundwork for the economic dominance of the Italian merchant class during the Renaissance. However, it's important to recognize that the Crusades weren't just about cultural exchange and economic gain. The darker side of this era involved persecution, violence, and intolerance. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099, when European soldiers massacred large numbers of Jews and Muslims, stands as a grim reminder of the destructive potential of religious fervor. The Crusades also played a role in fanning anti-Semitism in Europe, often targeting local Jewish populations. Furthermore, the expansionist goals of the European kingdoms into the Levant were deeply entwined with broader geopolitical ambitions. The desire for power and prestige was a driving force behind many monarchs' decisions to participate in the Crusades. As European states grew in wealth and influence, they sought to extend their dominion eastward. While the Crusades might appear as momentary blips on the vast map of medieval history, their echoes resonate throughout European chronicles. This fusion of cultures profoundly affected the course of European civilization. The subsequent Crusades, including those to Russia, the Baltic region, and even Asia, continued to expose Europeans to diverse cultures and ideas. Each expedition brought back new perspectives, influencing everything from local crafts to the worldview of the educated elite. The very states created during the Crusades, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though short-lived, served as points of cultural exchange for several decades. They acted as bridges between the West and the East until they were eventually dissolved or absorbed into neighboring Muslim domains. Despite the eventual failure of the crusading enterprise to hold onto territory in the Levant, its impact on Europe was indelible. In hindsight, it's clear that the Crusades represent much more than just military campaigns. They were catalysts for cultural fusion, economic transformation, and intellectual awakening. The encounter with the advanced civilizations of the East shook Europe out of its medieval slumber. European scholars and merchants returned home enriched by their experiences, eager to share and adapt the knowledge and goods they had discovered. The legacy of this encounter is evident in the art, architecture, science, and even cuisine of medieval Europe. And while the Crusades were often marked by conflict and intolerance, it was precisely this clash of cultures that set the stage for some of the most significant changes in European history. Now it's time to hear from you. What surprised you the most about the cultural impact of the Crusades? Did you know about these influences before watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to show your support if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching. In this episode, we'll see how the Crusades reshaped the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine Empire, creating a lasting legacy of mistrust and hostility between two branches of Christianity. By the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was a seasoned veteran in the art of warfare, having spent centuries defending its borders against external threats. But by this time, Western Europe was still very much a novice in the field of large-scale organized military campaigns. And so when the opportunity arose to collaborate, it was almost inevitable that the Byzantines would take on a more prominent role in planning strategy and tactics. For instance, when the Crusaders first arrived in Byzantine territory on their way to the Holy Land, it was the Byzantines who taught them how to adapt to the region's unique terrain and climate. They also provided valuable insights on how to deal with the local Muslim adversaries. Conversely, the Western Europeans brought a level of manpower and enthusiasm that the Byzantines could not match. The sheer number of European warriors flooding into the region quickly overwhelmed any numerical advantage the Muslims might have had. During the First Crusade, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos initially attempted to play the Europeans against the Turks by encouraging the Crusaders to seize lands east of the Sea of Marmara. However, he soon discovered that these aspirations were far grander than he had anticipated. As the Crusaders advanced, they swiftly captured cities such as Nicaea and Antioch, presenting Alexios with a fait accompli. Recognizing the potential threat posed by these formidable Western armies, Alexios adopted a cautious approach. He understood that the Crusaders, driven by religious zeal, were unlikely to heed his calls for restraint or consider the broader geopolitical implications of their actions. Instead, he focused on securing their passage through his territory by demanding oaths of fealty from the Crusader leaders, obliging them to return any Byzantine lands they might recapture to imperial rule. Following the establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant, a complex dynamic emerged between the Latin kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire. Initially, there were hopes that these new Christian states would form a united front against Muslim powers, working together to expand their shared territory and protect their interests. However, this vision of cooperation never materialized. Instead, rivalry and suspicion took root, shaping a turbulent relationship characterized by shifting alliances and broken treaties. The Second Crusade, which commenced in 1147, offers a clear illustration of this contentious relationship. The catalyst for this crusade was the fall of the county of Edessa in 1144, a small crusader state situated in northern Mesopotamia. The Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem appealed to Pope Eugenius III, urging him to launch a new crusade to recover Edessa. Unlike the initial crusade, which had a strong popular and spontaneous character, the Second Crusade was largely a product of church organization. Pope Eugene's call to action was enthusiastically answered by European nobles, including Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, who assembled their armies and marched eastward. Upon hearing of this impending arrival, Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos saw an opportunity to bolster his position against the Seljuks. He sent envoys to the Western European courts seeking support for his own campaigns in Asia Minor. However, his requests were turned down flat. The European nobility, consumed by their own religious fervor, were not interested in Byzantine diplomacy or strategic considerations. They had come to reclaim Jerusalem, and anything less would be a disappointment. When the Crusaders entered Byzantine territory, they did so without any formal agreement or acknowledgement of Byzantine sovereignty. Instead, they claimed that Manuel was obligated to assist them due to his previous appeals for help against the Seljuks. This perceived slight deeply offended the Byzantines, who saw the Crusaders' entry as a violation of their territorial integrity and a challenge to their authority. The Crusaders' presence caused widespread discontent among the local Greek population, who viewed the Westerners as unwelcome guests encroaching on their land. As the Crusades progressed, tensions escalated. The Crusaders, eager to fulfill their holy mission, began seizing towns and villages within Byzantine borders, claiming that they were doing so to prevent them from falling into Seljuk hands. This blatant disregard for Byzantine sovereignty only served to deepen the rift between the two Christian factions. Rather than cooperating to advance the overall goal of pushing back the Seljuks, the Crusaders' actions forced the Byzantines into a defensive posture. Manuel I was compelled to divert resources away from his own offensive operations to counter the Crusader incursions and protect his realm. His attempts at diplomacy were ignored, and he was left with no choice but to resist what he saw as a growing threat to his empire's security and territorial integrity. The growth of mutual hostility was not solely due to Byzantine-Latin relations during the Crusades, but the Crusades certainly accelerated the process. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, the relationship had deteriorated significantly. The earlier attempts at cooperation and the sense of shared purpose had devolved into open antagonism and suspicion. To make matters worse, the memory of past grievances continued to fester, limiting the possibility of reconciliation. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders with deep resentment, blaming them for the fragmentation of their empire and the destruction caused during the sack of Constantinople. The sack not only resulted in immense material damage, but also caused a profound cultural shock. The looting of libraries and the desecration of churches were seen as sacrilegious acts that violated the core principles of their faith. In the aftermath of the sack, the Byzantines accused the Crusaders of lacking genuine piety and questioned their commitment to Christianity. They argued that the Crusaders' actions were driven by selfish motives, such as the desire for wealth and power, rather than true religious devotion. This mutual recrimination created a climate of distrust that made cooperation nearly impossible. Each side saw the other as untrustworthy and harboring hostile intentions. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as opportunistic invaders seeking to expand their territory and influence in the East. The Crusaders, in turn, suspected that the Byzantines were secretly plotting with the Muslims to undermine their efforts. The effects of this antagonism extended beyond the realm of religious and cultural exchanges. Political and economic ties were severed, leading to the breakdown of diplomatic relations and the cessation of trade between the two regions. The Byzantine Empire, already facing numerous external threats, was deprived of valuable trading partners and sources of revenue. Similarly, the Crusader states lost access to Byzantine markets and the flow of goods from the east. This economic isolation hindered the development of both regions and reinforced the us versus them mentality that characterized their relationship. Moreover, the divergence in religious practices and doctrines contributed to the deepening divide. The Orthodox Byzantines and the Roman Catholics in the West followed different liturgical traditions, had distinct theological perspectives, and recognized different religious authorities. These differences, which had long been a source of tension, became more pronounced during the Crusades as each side sought to impose its own beliefs on the other. The failure of any efforts at reconciliation only served to widen the gap between them, making compromise and cooperation increasingly elusive. Thus, the Crusades played a pivotal role in shaping the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine Empire. What began as a potential alliance against a common enemy evolved into a legacy of mistrust, hostility, and competing interests. The consequences of this fractured relationship were profound, affecting not only the course of medieval history, but also the cultural and religious landscape of Europe and the Middle East. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up to show your support. And don't forget to subscribe for more engaging historical content. Thanks for watching. When the Crusades set out from Europe toward the Islamic East at the end of the 11th century, they were not merely religious wars or a struggle over land. They were also a turning point in the history of cultural and military exchange between the East and the West. During this period, Europeans encountered advanced techniques and combat strategies they had not previously known, leaving a profound impact on their military and industrial development in subsequent centuries. Among the most notable innovations the Crusaders brought back to Europe was in the field of military engineering. In the 12th century, when European armies reached the Levant and Mesopotamia, they came face to face with some of the most sophisticated castles in the world, all built by Muslims. These castles, built in Syria and Egypt, not only utilized towering structures and protective walls, but also showcased intricate designs that withstood attacks much more effectively than the rudimentary fortifications found in Europe. Castles like Masyaf in Syria and the citadel of Aleppo stood as symbols of Islamic architectural prowess, boasting multiple layers of defense that confounded European siege tactics. What distinguished these Islamic fortresses from their European counterparts was their focus on earthquake resistance and innovative defense mechanisms. Most notably, these castles featured rounded towers instead of the square towers prevalent in Europe. This design choice was crucial because it minimized the impact of catapult strikes, ensuring that even if a tower was struck, the damage was localized and did not compromise the entire structure. Earthquakes were also a common occurrence in the region, and the circular design of the towers and castle walls allowed them to better withstand seismic activity, preventing catastrophic collapses. European military engineers were astounded by the effectiveness of these castles and the ingenuity behind their construction. Even the deep moats surrounding the castles were designed to impede the progress of attackers, forcing them to traverse narrow bridges that could be easily defended. The winding entrance passages prevented surprise attacks and funneled attackers into predictable routes, making it easier to repel invasions. Once European forces began capturing these castles, as in the case of Crac des Chevaliers, they were quick to emulate and improve upon the architectural marvels they had once struggled to breach. Consequently, a new era of castle construction commenced in Europe, characterized by innovative designs and advanced engineering. Castles like Dover Castle in England incorporated elements of Islamic architecture, reflecting the influence of the Crusader experience. They integrated principles of earthquake resistance, incorporating rounded towers and strategic moat systems that had been observed and studied during the Crusades. It is important to note that while Europeans were exposed to advanced Islamic architectural ideas during the Crusades, The exchange was not one way. European architectural traditions also had an impact on the East, although the extent of this influence was more limited due to the relatively short duration of the Crusader states and the lack of large-scale construction projects. Another significant area where the Crusaders learned from their Eastern adversaries was in the realm of siege techniques. In the Middle Ages, the art of besieging a city or castle was as important as the defense itself. Both sides employed a variety of tactics and technologies to gain the upper hand. When European forces engaged Muslim and Byzantine armies, they witnessed the use of more advanced siege weapons and strategies than they were accustomed to in their own regions. Siege weapons were essential in the 12th century, and the Crusaders were particularly impressed by the counterweight trebuchet, which was widely used in the Islamic world. This type of trebuchet was a massive catapult that used a weighted arm to launch projectiles with greater force and accuracy than the simpler trebuchets found in Europe. These counterweight catapults could hurl stones, mangonels, and other objects over castle walls, causing significant destruction and casualties within a fortified area. The Crusaders also observed the use of other advanced siege engines, including battering rams, which were often covered in iron to enhance their destructive capabilities, and siege towers, which were mobile platforms that allowed troops to approach a castle wall without being exposed. They also gained knowledge of tunneling under castle walls and detonating them using gunpowder, a technique pioneered by the Chinese and refined by Muslims. This knowledge would later contribute to the development of more advanced cannons in Europe during the late Middle Ages. The Crusaders were able to acquire this knowledge through observation and interaction with the armies they faced in the East. As they participated in battles and sieges, they had the opportunity to study the siege techniques and weaponry employed by the Muslims and Byzantines. Furthermore, many Crusaders, including some of the high-ranking clergy, were literate and some even spoke Arabic. This enabled them to read military texts and manuals that described siege strategies and construction techniques. By documenting what they observed and incorporating this knowledge into their own military manuals, the Crusaders ensured that these valuable lessons would not be lost. One example of this is the siege of a castle in 1148 by a Crusader army that successfully employed a tunnel to undermine the castle walls and ignite them with gunpowder. Individual weaponry was another area where the Crusaders observed and adopted improvements after encountering Muslim soldiers. European knights initially wore heavy armor that restricted their movement and was challenging to put on and take off. In contrast, many Muslim soldiers wore lightweight chainmail armor and helmets designed to deflect sword strikes without being as cumbersome. This difference in armor inspired European knights to modify their attire, gradually making their armor more flexible and practical. One significant change was the adoption of lighter chainmail shirts under heavier armor. This innovation allowed for greater mobility while still providing protection against arrows and swords. Additionally, European armorers began creating helmets with elongated visors that covered the face and neck, inspired by the design of Islamic helmets. This improved design offered more comprehensive protection and was more suitable for combat. The Crusaders also acquired improved weapons from the Islamic world, including a type of curved sword that was more efficient in slashing and thrusting movements. Furthermore, European sword makers were influenced by Islamic sword makers who were renowned for their ability to produce exceptionally hard and sharp blades. Islamic sword makers had mastered the art of Damascus steel, which was highly prized for its quality. European smiths began experimenting with new mining and forging techniques to create similar high-quality blades. The impact of these innovations can be seen in the development of longswords and rapiers in Europe during the following centuries. Military medicine was yet another field where the Crusaders made significant strides thanks to their experiences in the East. European military medicine was still in its early stages of development when the Crusaders encountered Muslim and Byzantine doctors. At that time, European medical practices were often influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, whereas Eastern medicine had advanced significantly since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Muslim physicians were at the forefront of medical knowledge and had made substantial progress in fields such as anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology. In the 12th century, Muslim doctors had a deep understanding of human anatomy, having conducted dissections and produced detailed illustrations of internal organs. They also developed advanced surgical techniques to treat battlefield injuries. On the other hand, European surgeons were generally less skilled and their treatments were often ineffective or even harmful. The Crusaders observed the advanced medical techniques used by Muslim physicians, including methods for treating wounds and stopping bleeding, such as cauterization and the use of alcohol-based substances for sterilization. This exposure to more effective medical practices led to improvements in the treatment of soldiers' injuries. Furthermore, Muslim pharmacists had created a vast array of medicinal compounds derived from plants and minerals that were used to treat various ailments. The Crusaders acquired knowledge of these remedies and incorporated them into their own medical practices. This introduction of new drugs and treatments reduced fatalities among soldiers and enhanced overall health. The trade that flourished during the Crusader era also played a major role in the transfer of technological innovations. Through Italian ports such as Venice and Genoa, valuable goods like silk and cotton flowed into Europe, along with paper-making techniques learned from the Arabs. This knowledge facilitated the production of books and the dissemination of scientific manuscripts. European merchants and travelers returning from the East brought with them samples of these products and stories of advanced manufacturing processes. For instance, Venetian merchants familiar with the production of glass objects in the Islamic world likely brought back samples of fine glassware and descriptions of the techniques used in their creation. Similarly, Genoese sailors who had encountered the superior shipbuilding methods of the Arabs may have brought back fragments of more durable and efficient ships or detailed sketches of shipbuilding techniques. The Crusaders' exposure to these innovations sparked curiosity and a desire to understand the underlying technologies and craftsmanship involved. Some Crusaders, such as those who had dealings with merchants or spent time in urban centers, were more likely to come into contact with these goods and innovations and subsequently share their knowledge with others upon their return to Europe. In conclusion, the Crusades, despite their bloody and conflict-ridden nature, served as a bridge for cultural exchange between East and West. The Crusaders' direct experience with advanced Islamic technology left an indelible mark on medieval Europe. From the adoption of Arabic numerals to the application of siege techniques, from improvements in military medicine to the integration of architectural innovations, the Crusades marked a pivotal point in Europe's journey towards modernization. Many of the innovations introduced during this period became the cornerstone of Europe's subsequent military and industrial revolutions. Thus, the Crusades not only shaped the course of medieval history, but also sowed the seeds for future advancements. Thank you for watching. Want to know more about how medieval Christians demonized Muslims, or how anti-Semitic stereotypes took root in medieval Europe? Keep watching. When people today talk about the Crusades, they usually focus on the holy wars that took place between Christian Europe and Muslim-ruled Jerusalem. But although many of us have heard about the Crusades, fewer of us know much about what life was like for Muslims living outside of Jerusalem during the era of the Crusades. And when it comes to the impact the Crusades had on the broader European mindset, few topics are more fascinating than how the Crusades affected European views of Muslims and Jews. The Crusades were a series of religiously charged military campaigns backed by the Latin Church in the medieval West that took place between the 11th and 13th centuries. And while the Crusades targeted Muslim rulers in the Levant, they also had a profound effect on how medieval Europeans thought about Jews living in their midst. And as you will see, it wasn't always in positive ways. To understand the changes the Crusades brought to European perceptions of Muslims, let's first consider what life was like before the Crusades. As historian Thomas Madden writes, before the Crusades, medieval Europeans knew relatively little about Muslims. For one thing, contact between Christian Europe and the rest of the Islamic world was fairly limited. Trade along the Mediterranean coast ensured that certain goods made their way into European markets, but the average European had little contact with those goods' Muslim producers. Instead, Europeans' ideas about Muslims came from second-hand accounts. Most descriptions of Islam came from Byzantine accounts of battles with Muslims on the edges of the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as stories about Muslim rule in Iberia and Sicily. And these stories were not always flattering. Although the Umayyad Caliphate conquered Iberia in 711, by the late 1000s, only a small portion of the Iberian Peninsula was ruled by Muslims. Meanwhile, Sicily had fallen under Muslim control in 827, but by the late 1000s, it was ruled by a Muslim dynasty allied with the Byzantine Empire. For their part, Muslims in Iberia and Sicily developed sophisticated cultures and economies, but because contact between Muslims and Northern Europeans was so rare, most Europeans did not view Muslims as sophisticated people. They simply viewed them as outsiders whose religion threatened the security of Christian Europe. This perception of Muslims as a threatening other was also encouraged by the writings of Christian theologians who stressed the importance of fighting non-Christians in order to spread Christianity. Theologians like Peter the Lombard, who wrote a standard textbook used in medieval theology schools, taught that it was a Christian's duty to wage war against infidels. As a result, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, his audience was primed to view Muslims as inherently dangerous. But what about Jews? Like Muslims, Jews had lived in Europe for centuries. During the early Middle Ages, Jews lived in relative peace in many parts of Western Europe, although they were expected to pay special taxes and abide by certain restrictions. Nevertheless, medieval Jews participated fully in European society. Many were merchants or artisans. And while anti-Jewish riots did occur, they were relatively rare, but that was about to change. As Crusade fever swept across Europe, Jews became caught in the crossfire. Although the Crusades were aimed at Muslims, many European Christians began to see Jews as obstacles to the success of the Holy War. Why? Because of a theological doctrine known as the doctrine of discovery. According to this teaching, which originated with St. Augustine, medieval theologians claimed that Jews and Muslims could help spread God's word, but because they rejected Jesus' divinity, they could not attain salvation. Since Jews and Muslims were stuck in a state of original sin, Christians felt compelled to convert them to Christianity. If that meant expelling or massacring Jews who refused to convert, well, so be it. As historian Jonathan Phillips writes, the idea that Jews and Muslims could be good, honorable people, decent human beings, citizens of the world and members of an organized religion, never really took root in Christian Europe. In 1096, thousands of German Jews converted or were expelled from their homes. And that same year, a popular rumor spread throughout Europe claiming that Jewish elders had poisoned wells where Christian pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land were getting sick. As a result, hundreds of Jews were murdered across the Rhineland. So what about after the Crusades? To answer that question, let us take a closer look at how European perceptions of Muslims changed as a result of the Crusades. What effect did the Crusades have on European perceptions of Muslims? The effects of the Crusades on European perceptions of Muslims were both complex and contradictory. On the one hand, the Crusades were a disaster for Muslims. Over the course of the next centuries, Christian armies seized Jerusalem and other vital cities in the region. By the mid-1200s, Christian kingdoms controlled all of the Levant except for Egypt and the Ayyubid dynasty in Syria. However, although the Crusades were bad news for Muslims politically and religiously, they did inspire European fascination with the sophistication of Islamic civilization. Consider, for example, that Muslim rulers had established impressive universities and hospitals in their domains. Furthermore, Muslim scholars had preserved ancient Greek texts and helped preserve the works of classical Roman authors. But these accomplishments were lost on most Europeans, who focused instead on the region's religious significance. One of the main results of the Crusades was the creation of an enduring stereotype of Muslims as exotic, fanatical, and uncivilized peoples. That is because Christian writers focused on painting Muslims as Christ killers who worshipped false idols and had no respect for Christian holy sites. Let's look more closely at how they did this. For starters, medieval European writers drew a clear contrast between themselves and Muslims, frequently using insulting language to describe their opponents. Consider the writings of Louis the German, a contemporary of the First Crusade, who wrote, "The Muslims do not believe that the flesh of swine is unclean, but eat it with great pleasure." They also use a cup made of the hide of a dead camel instead of a church. In this passage, Louis associates Muslims with filth and backwardness and portrays them superstitious and disgusting. Moreover, medieval European writers insisted that Muslims were violent by nature, often drawing on lurid tales about Muslims in Crusade propaganda. The Muslim ruler of Jerusalem, for instance, was said to throw his Christian captives into the sea and pull out their beards to see if they would swim. Another story held that Muslim women dipped their bread in blood instead of wine. Tales like these may not have been true, but they did serve to portray Muslims as treacherous, violent, and bloodthirsty. Finally, European writers repeated the slander that Muslims profaned Christian holy places, such as when Pope Eugene III claimed that Muslim rulers had defiled the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by throwing excrement out the window. These sorts of claims serve to dehumanize Muslims and make the crusade against them seem holy and just. But it wasn't all negative. Some European writers, such as William of Tyre, offered balanced accounts of Muslim rule in the Levant. Still, these voices were far outweighed by those who emphasized the supposed backwardness of Muslims. And the stereotype that created endured for centuries. How did the Crusades shape European perceptions of Jews? The Crusades had an equally devastating impact on European perceptions of Jews. Despite living in Europe for centuries, Jews continued to be stereotyped as outsiders and threats to Christian society. But during the Crusades, anti-Jewish feeling reached new heights. That's because as Crusade fever swept across Europe, preachers and pamphleteers depicted Jews as tools of Satan and enemies of Christ. Consider the writings of Nicholas of Cusa, who asserted that Jews had poisoned the wells of pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land, or listen to the inflammatory words of Abbot Samson of Douai, who declared, "Not only does the Jew know all vices, but he practices all infamies, and he is the servant of Satan, the son of perdition, who has blinded the eyes of all nations." Once this sort of rhetoric became commonplace, violence against Jews followed. In 1096, the First Crusade got underway without any papal blessing. Thousands of German and French peasants took up arms and headed east, slaughtering Jews along the way. Many of those Jews died trying to flee, while others were burned alive in their homes. Altogether, some 90,000 Jews perished in the popular revolt. And while official crusades would target Muslims, European Jews continued to suffer. In 1146, for instance, when rumors spread that Muslim forces had recaptured Jerusalem, European Jews were blamed for the calamity. As a result, tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered across Germany and France. After the Crusades ended in 1291, things did not improve. Jews were scapegoated for a variety of ills, including economic hardship and disease outbreaks. Moreover, Jews were increasingly confined to ghettos and forbidden from owning property or participating in public life. By the 1290s, Jews had been expelled from England and France, and the Spanish Inquisition sought to force conversion or expulsion among European Jews. In the end, the Crusades played a major role in shaping Europe's view of Muslims and Jews. Whereas previously Muslims had been viewed as distant foreigners, the Crusades created a hostile image of Muslims as Christ killers, barbarians, and violent fanatics. Meanwhile, the Crusades transformed medieval European views of Jews, contributing to centuries of persecution and anti-Semitic stereotypes. But while the Crusades proved disastrous for Muslims and Jews, they did contribute to cultural exchanges, intellectual, commercial, and artistic, that gradually reshaped Europe. Indeed, the very stereotypes the Crusades reinforced were sometimes challenged by first-hand encounters, but that's a topic for another video. If you enjoyed learning more about how the Crusades impacted European views of Muslims and Jews, check out my video on how the Crusades started. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to catch future installments and leave me a comment. Do you think the Crusades ultimately did more harm than good? Thanks again and see you next time.